Hello, in this video the main focus will be on 3 AWS services: API Gateway, Lambda, and Secrets Manager. That's going to be the second half of the video. First half is going to be the simple iteration where we call this ESV API. ESV is a translation of the Bible, and the ESV API is provided by Crossway, where we can search for verses or passages. And it's really simple. You just make a call to the API and you get back a response. Second half of the video, we are going to use Secrets Manager because in the first video I'll show you, or the first part of the video that is, let's say we want to search for a passage. I'm going to search for Romans 3:21 through 26. I search for the passage and I get back a response, and I put the HTML response. There are different endpoints you can hit here: plain text, HTML. The one I'm going to use in the video is for HTML. Now, again, this is the simple iteration. Just like that, make a request to the API, get back a response. The problem is, if you make this a public-facing website and you want to keep your API key a secret, because you have to use an API key when you do this. So I'm going to query that again. If I look in here, I can see that the API key is being sent right here, authorization header. So this is my API secret key, and I'm showing to you in the video. By the time you see this, I will have already deleted it from my account. You'll have to create an account if you want to follow along in this part and code along, and you want to use the ESV API. You're going to have your own application. This is free. You just create your account with ESV and then create an API application. I've got one here. And then you're going to have your authorization token. This is the API key. And again, I'm going to delete this. I'm showing you in the video to make it easier to follow along. And then in the second half, when we work with the AWS Secrets Manager, I'm going to put it inside there. And then instead of making a direct call to ESV API, we're going to hit the API Gateway, which is going to trigger a Lambda, which is going to grab the secret key from Secrets Manager and then call the ESV API and then get the response back. So it is more complicated, but you get to keep your API key a secret, or whatever you happen to put in Secrets Manager, you can keep it a secret in there. So keys, passwords, things like that. And again, this is the ESV API. It's free to create an account, but you do have to create an account. If you don't want to create the UI, you're just more interested in the second part of the video, well, you can check the timestamps and watch whatever part applies to you. First thing I'm going to do is build out a new project. I've got a folder in here called ESV API, and I'm going to create everything in Visual Studio Code. This is going to be a quick UI using Bootstrap 5. And so first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a file called index.html. I know I'm going to need some other files, so I'm going to create a style.css. And I'm going to create a script.js. So for the HTML, use an emit here. I'll call this ESV API. And I'm going to add, since we're going to use Bootstrap for this, I'm going to create a link. Style, I'll leave that there for now because I'm gonna create some very minimal styles in there. And then one more, I'm gonna replace this with the Bootstrap link. So get started with Bootstrap. This is version 5.2. I'm going to go down and grab CDN. So there's the CSS. I'm going to grab this. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the JavaScript. All right, there's our Bootstrap CSS. Then we can add in the JavaScript. And I'm going to put that down at toward the bottom. So script, I'm going to drop it right in here. And then for the HTTP calls, I'm going to use Axios in here. When we get to AWS, I'm going to use fetch. We're going to use node for our lambdas, and I'm going to use the fetch API. But in here, I'm going to use Axios. And then go to the Axios, and I'm going to just use the CDN here. And I'm going to drop it in VS Code. So that should be all that we need for the styles and for JavaScript. So now I'm going to continue to build out here. And let's see here. I'm going to create a div with a class container. And then we're going to have a main tag, h1, and then I'm going to give it a class of text center, text secondary, margin top of 5, and display 4. And this is going to say Crossway ESV API. And then we're going to say passage HTML. As I mentioned, we have a few different options. We've got plain text, HTML, audio files, and a passage search. And I'm working with HTML in this video. So in that passage HTML, first thing is I'm going to say section, and I'm going to give it a class of section as well. And I'm going to give the div with margin bottom 3. I'm going to create the input. And it's going to have a class of form control. These are that's a Bootstrap class. And an ID of HTML first search. I know that's a long ID, but it is descriptive. And let's give a placeholder as well here. So the placeholder for this is going to be search for a verse or passage. Then I'm going to say e.g. John 1:1. Okay, and then let's create our button, and this button is going to be the same length as the input. So I'm going to give it a class of the grid and gap2. This is what's used in the place of the old button block class. And we're going to create a button with a class of btn, btn secondary, and margin bottom 3. I'm going to give it an ID of HTML button. We'll give it a type button as well. And then on click, we're going to create a JavaScript function called getPassageHTML. get passage. And then right under here, this, we're going to have another div, an ID of HTML passage with a class of text center. And we're going to leave that there. This is going to be filled in with JavaScript. So that's all we need in our main section. So let's see what that looks like. Create a little space here. I'm going to open it up with live server. So that's a little bit too big, so I'm going to go ahead and change one thing. I'm going to go into that style CSS that we created and just quickly add that section class that we created. I'm going to say max width 700 pixels. I'm going to do a margin left auto, and I'm going to do a margin right auto. Save that. All right, that's a little bit better. So let's bring that over. So now we've got the basics of our UI there. But we want to add one more thing. When we're looking, Crossway tells us, go in here. There's some, right here, some conditions on if you're going to use this API. And there's something in here about copyright notice. And this is for a copyright section. This is just going to be one page. And so I'm just going to add it right there, right here on the same page. It's going to end up looking like this. And when you click it, you would get the notice inside there. This is optional. If you're going to publish your site somewhere, then you should do this. I'm just going to throw it in here now. And the way we're going to do it is also with Bootstrap. So I'm going to create a horizontal rule with a class of margin top 5. Just going to put a line in there. And then I'm going to create another section with a class of section. And under there, I'm going to have a paragraphs with a class of text center. And inside here, there's going to be a button, btn, btn light, type equals button. And we're also going to have data bs toggle equals collapse, data bs target equals collapse example. Inside here, we're going to say copyright notice. So save that. And it's just going to be copyright notice. And when you expand this out, it's going to have 2 paragraphs. It's mentioned in here. You need to do one of the following. So you have these two, or these two. It says basically the same thing, worded a little bit differently. So under the button, under that paragraph, we're going to have another div class of collapse, ID of collapse example. And we're going to have another div in here with a class of card body. And then we're going to have 2 paragraphs. And then we're just going to grab the paragraphs out of here. So here's the first one. Drop it in. And then the second one. Drop it in there. Let's go back to our app. Save. Then when we click on the box, there's our copyright notice. Now, nothing's going to happen if we search because we don't have any JavaScript connected yet. So that's where we need to start working on the JavaScript. We're going to search for a passage and get HTML text returned. There's going to be an asynchronous function. Get passage HTML. Let's double check that. Get passage HTML. Okay. We're going to say const button equals document get element by ID HTML button. Button.class list .add. This is a Bootstrap class where as soon as we click on the button to get a passage, it's going to dim, gray out, and it becomes inactive, so you can't keep clicking it while searching. And then we're going to have another constant HTML passage text equals document get element by ID HTML passage. And we're going to have HTML passage text dot inner HTML equals, we're going to use backticks here. We're going to have a div, the class of spinner grow, and text secondary. Role equals status. Inside here, there'll be a span, a class of visually hidden. Close out the span and the closing div tag. There we go. And we're going to have a const q. This is going to be the one and only required query parameter. HTML verse search input. Dot value. And we're going to do a try catch. So try const response equals await axios.get. Use backticks again. And for the HTML endpoint here, you can see what we need to call. There's a curl example using curl, but we're not doing that. We're using doing it through a UI with JavaScript. Copy this, but we're not actually going to use this whole thing. Let's put, as you can see in here, So you've got the query parameter in here. Some of you may know already, of course, and some of you may not, but you have path parameters and query parameters. When you have that question mark, it's going to be a query parameter. So it's not really part of the path or part of the resource. You can think of it as a way to filter the results you get when you hit this resource. I'm not actually going to include it though. I'm going to do it a different way. So I'm going to put a comma right here. And inside here, I'm going to send the params separately. So Q, the one and only required parameter, is going to be right here. And then I'm also going to send some headers, authorization. And this is where you have to send your API key. So in order to get your API key, you need an account. If you already have an account with this API ESV.org, and it's free. But once you have you create an API application, which I created one, and then you get your authorization token, my token here. This is going to be deleted. Right before I publish the video, I'm going to delete this key and create a new one, but I'm leaving it in here so everybody can watch how I do this. So we're going to send this authorization key, and so we're trying, so it's a try catch. So let me go ahead and write catch. If there's an error here, I'm just going to console log it. We'll come back to that. So we've got our params, we've got headers. We're going to say HTML passage text dot inner HTML equals response dot data dot passages. And I'll show you here in just a minute why it's called that, response dot data dot passages. And then we're going to say button class list dot remove. We're going to remove that disabled. So you're free to search something else. But if there's an error, HTML passage text that inner HTML will show the error there instead. Now, this is not what you want to do in production necessarily, just for simplicity here. This is not going to be focused on best practices for user experience and error handling. This is mainly just to show you the easy way that you can call an API directly, and then one way that is a little bit more complicated, but also more secure. And then we're going to say button.classList.remove disabled. So when your search is done, whether you replace with the text, you replace the spinner with the Bible verse or whatever API you're using, or if you get an error, either way, you want to remove the disable class so somebody can use the button again. So now that that is done, we've got our JavaScript and we've got our HTML. We'll save that. And if everything is right, we should be able to search for a verse now. So if I go in here and I search for a verse, I'm going to search for a passage. I'm going to search for Ephesians 1. No, I'll search for Ephesians 2, 1 through 10. All right, nothing happened. Let's check. So am I getting any errors? Get passage HTML is not defined. 22, away. So let's see. Get passage HTML. It's not defined. Of course. The reason it's not defined is because I did not include the JavaScript. So let's do that. Final script tag. Script.js. A lot of you probably noticed that. That is why. All right, let's try this again now. So let's search for Ephesians 2, 1 through 10. All right, that worked. So we were able to successfully call the ESV API. We've got our passage. And we can look at the network tab here and we can see we called it. We sent the API key. That was our query, Ephesians 2, 1 through 10. And you can see what we got back was passages. So that's what, in case anybody was wondering. If that didn't make sense to you, the response.data.passages. So we've got a working API and everything is fine. But again, the second point of the video, which is coming up now, is if this API or any API and you didn't want to put the key right there, if the API that you're calling requires a key and you don't want the public to be able to see it, well, one option you have is putting it in something like AWS Secrets Manager. So instead of making this simple, quick, call the ESV API, get a response, we're going to hit the API gateway, trigger a Lambda, get the secret, then call the ESV API. Now, before we jump into the AWS console and start creating our API gateway and Lambda function, then I do want to consider one thing here. If we have inside here, if we make a call, I'm going to search for John 1:1. I got the passage. We make the call directly to the ESV API. I get that response back in 72 milliseconds. So that's really fast. When we put an extra call in between there, it's not going to be quite as fast. It'll still be really fast, but not quite as fast. So that is something to consider. So let's jump into the AWS console now. We're going to need API Gateway, Lambda, and Secrets Manager. We're also going to get access to CloudWatch. So if something happens inside of your Lambda and you want to know why is there an error, we can look in the CloudWatch logs for that. So the first thing we'll do is create our Lambda. And we need a new one. I'm not going to create a layer. We will, but not yet. First thing we're going to do is create the function. So create a function. And we're going to author it from scratch. And we can call this Crossway API. That's what we'll call it. And we're going to use Node.js 18. All right. So we automatically get an execution role with permissions to CloudWatch logs. We're also going to add permission for Secrets Manager. We get that automatically. And we'll wait for that. Advanced settings. We won't change any advanced settings for now. So Crossway API is what I'm going to call it. Call it whatever you want. Create the Lambda. It'll take just a minute. I'm going to create a new window here, duplicate, and I'm going to open up API Gateway. And I'll do that one more time. Secrets Manager. Now my secret is already created in here. I have an API key for this ESV API. It's really easy to create one though. Doesn't take long at all. So let's go back to our, so right here we have our Lambda. This is some code. We're not gonna use this. We're gonna write our own code. But we have a Lambda, and if we look in here and monitor, this is where we're gonna have access right here. View CloudWatch logs, and we'll look at that here in a minute. Well, we have our Lambda, and also let's go ahead and create our API for API Gateway. So I'm going to create a REST API build. Okay, REST. This is going to be a new API. And we're going to call this, you can see I've created several. I'm going to call it Crossway, doesn't matter. Let's call it just like this, passage HTML. And the reason I'm calling it that is so we can stay consistent here. This is called passage HTML, and that's the one we're using. So this one I could have called the same thing too, Crossway API. We're just doing one for an example, but that's something to keep in mind. Keeping names consistent. All right, so description, just going to say call ESV API and HTML will be returned. We're going to leave this regional, create API. No methods. We will need, so one of the things that we need to do is add a trigger to this Lambda. So what tells the Lambda to start running? Well, we're going to use API Gateway for that. So we just created that. And then use an existing API. And we only have one. And let's use it. So whenever somebody hits this endpoint of our API Gateway, then this Lambda code is going to be triggered. So deployment stage, we need a deployment stage. So I'm going to call it. We don't have a stage yet actually. So let's see if I can skip that part. No. So we go in here and let's create a method here. This is going to be a get. HTTP get endpoint. We're just going to leave it as is. No, actually, we want to leave this as Lambda function because that is what we want to run. So we need to put the Lambda function in here. So that is this Lambda function. So let me back up here. Let's get this ARN. We're going to put it in here. Save that. You're about to give, so we're given API gateway permission to invoke Lambda. Okay. That's what we want to do. So let's go back here now. Add a trigger. So for our trigger API gateway, use an existing. I probably still have to put a stage, so let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to deploy it so we can create a stage, a new stage, and this is going to be, we'll call this beta. New stage, beta. Not going to do a description for now. Deploy it. Let's go back to the Lambda for the trigger, refresh. So we're going to use our beta stage. Configure the security. And here we're going to leave it open for now. And let's add. Okay. So we've got a trigger there. That's how you would invoke. So let's do this. Let's open this up in a new tab. And hello from Lambda. So that's working. So whenever you hit this API endpoint here, this Amazon API gateway endpoint, we're going to get back this hello from Lambda, which if we look at our code inside the Lambda function is right there. Ultimately, that's not what we're going to do, because what we want to do is call the ESV API. And if you're curious why, if you're following along, coding along, and it doesn't look exactly like this inside of your browser, I'm using an extension here, JSON viewer, or JSON viewer. So that's why it looks like that. And unless the JSON response gets really big, if it's too big, it won't show up pretty in the viewer like this. But that's why it looks like that. Okay, so we've got our API, and there's a couple things we need to do inside of this beta stage. So for the Git, inside of resources, so there's a couple ways we can do this. We can just use the slash, or we can use the Crossway API. Either way. So for the time being, I just want to show you that you can do that. Actually, I'm just so it's not confusing at all. I'm going to see if I can delete this. I'm going to delete this resource. I'm just going to leave this Git. Okay, so in the method request, I'm going to add in a query parameter. And we're going to call it Q. You can call it whatever you want. It's called Q inside of the ESV API, and I'm doing this for consistency. So it's easy to match them up. And this one is required. And we also, let me go back here. So that did save. In the integration request, there's something else we need to do here. So down in the mapping templates, we're gonna, when there are no templates defined, so request body pass through, we're going to add a mapping template here. And this is going to be application/JSON and generate template method request pass through. And we're not going to change this. And this is going to give us access to the event that comes through when our Lambda code is run. This will make more sense once we're inside the Lambda. I'm going to save that. And this, something we need to do here. Enable cores. Enable cores. Replace. Yes. And then every time you do something you want to, and you're going to test it, you need to deploy it. And we have one stage, so we're going to deploy it to the beta stage. You can put a description if you want. Deploy. So that should be all that we need to do. So let's go into our Lambda now. So inside of our Lambda, we're going to need to call the ESV API, but we have to call it with a secret because we're not going to send the secret anymore. So originally, this is what we did. We put the authorization right inside the header. We're not going to do that anymore. I'm going to comment that out. So next time we make an API call, we're not going to call this address. We're going to call API gateway. So how are we going to get access to our secret? Well, inside of our Lambda, first thing we'll do is we're going to add a layer. So add a layer. And we're going to use one of the AWS layers. And it's this parameters. Pick the version there and then add your versions. I don't know if you're going to have the same version number there. Click add. So this simplifies it. This layer did not used to exist before, and there was more coding you had to do, but now that we add that in, go to Secrets Manager. I already have a secret. If you don't already have one in here and you've never done it, it's really easy. You can create whatever you want. Credentials, you can create an API key, OAuth token, etc. So you would choose API key, just like that, and you would enter a key value and go through the process. Very simple, but I already have one, so I'm not going to create a new one. I've got one called test/Crossway. I was using this, and I just left it the name. You can call it whatever you want. There's my secret description. And if you look down here, sample code. So if we put this inside the Lambda, and we used Node for the Lambda, if you put this inside there, then we're going to have access to our secret. And right there, it's got my secret name because that's the secret that I'm looking at right now. So after you create your secret, go down to the sample code and then copy that. And then I'm going to go back into my Lambda. And then inside the Lambda, I'm just going to completely start over. So I'm going to paste this into the top. Okay. Control V or Command V. So this right here gives you access to your secret. So I'm just going to put some lines here. So this right here, this is what AWS gave us. And really, this is what we need right here, secret. Got a variable called secret that we're going to use. So now, what we want to do is say, we're going to export the handler. And it's going to be asynchronous. So in this event, and all the information inside of the event, we have access to, because when we were inside of our API gateway, in the resources, in the options, inside of, not inside options, inside of integration requests, mapping templates, this mapping template, that's why we have access to it. All right. So a few things we need. I'm going to call it a key object, and we're going to use json.parse that secret, because that's how the secret is formatted that AWS has given us. And we're going to have an API key equals key object dot Crossway API. And it's dot Crossway API because that's what I called it. So if you go, I'm going to go into my secret here. So you go into the secret. I'm going to click retrieve secret value, and it's called Crossway API. Again, you can see my key right now, but I'm going to delete this before I publish the video. I'm going to delete this and create a new one. So back in the Lambda, that's why it says Crossway API right here. And then we're going to have parameters called Q. And it's going to be a string event rams dot query string dot Q. And the reason you have to put this long name is because that's what we're getting inside of the event. And if you want to see what that looks like, you can look at that inside of CloudWatch logs. For example, when we call this, we'll go back. So I'm going to say console log, and I'm just going to put the event in there so we can see it. And then I'll also, just so this is easy to pick out inside the log, because there's quite a bit of information in there, I'll just do that. So we'll copy that. And the other thing we're going to need is some search params. This is what we're going to add to the URL. It'll be different than we did before. We use this right here, params, but when we call it from Lambda, we're going to try it a different way, and we're going to put the params right there as a query parameter inside of the URL that we call. So search params is going to be equal new URL search params, and I'm going to pass in params. Then we're going to need a URL. This is going to be a string. And the URL that we're going to call is what we called earlier. So we'll call the URL here. And then add a question mark at the end, because you precede the query parameter with a question mark. So we've got the URL. And then URL plus equals search params. So that plus equals, if you've never seen that, same as URL equals URL plus search params. And then options. we're going to create this options. It's going to have the method in here is get. It's going to have headers. So just like before, inside of the header, we put authorization. And we're going to put the API key just like before. So instead of doing it from our web interface, we're going to do it inside of here. API key. All right. I think we're good there. We need a variable called response. And then we're going to do a try and response equals await fetch. We're not using Axios here. We're using fetch. We're going to call the URL with options and catch error. And if there's an error, we're going to console.log the error. And then we're going to return the response.json. Response is not defined. Please fix or add global response. Okay, try that response. So that should be see, am I missing something? So global response equals await fetch that response. So I will add in what this message says about global fetch. It is what we're doing. Global fetch. Response is not defined. Response is defined though, because I've got it here. Let response find out what I'm missing here. I don't think that's right. We're going to leave it for now and see what happens, but I've got it right here. So we're going to see what happens. Not sure why it's, unless I misspelled something. Oh, no wonder. Misspelled that. Sure. You're following along, you saw that. That's why. Okay. So there's response. So we're calling ESV API. We should be good to go now. So now I'm going to deploy that. If you don't deploy it, it's not going to work. So there's our Lambda. This is triggered by hitting the API gateway. And let's look back at our stages, the beta stage. So this is the URL. Let's open this now and see what happens. Error message, okay, which is probably not that surprising. And the reason why is because there is a required parameter, and that's Q, the search query, and we're not including it. So actually, this is a good time we can check out CloudWatch logs. Let's see what it says. So let's go to monitor. And view CloudWatch logs. And there's the log. So we can see undefined error. Access denied. Oh, yes, that is okay. We did not give permission for the Lambda. That makes perfect sense. Let's go back to the code. So the Lambda can't access the secret. That's why. So uncaught exception, access denied. Okay, so what we need to do is go into the configuration, permissions, and let's go in. Let's look at this. So we have permission for the CloudWatch logs, and we looked at the logs, so we know that's working. But inside this role here, let's go into add permissions, create inline policy, choose a service. It's going to do Secrets Manager. We want to read, we want to get a secret value, okay? And then specify, we could do that, we could specify exactly which secret it is. There's really only one, so we could give this permission to get any. But we could give access to only one specific secret, so let's go in there, let's do that. So we'll copy that and then give the access just for that one. So inside of add ARN to restrict access, we're gonna just put it right in there. And that's gonna fill in for us, add. Okay, we'll review the policy. It's gonna create that for us and create. And we gotta give it a name. So we'll call it get ESV API key. It's kind of hard to read. Create policy. Okay, so now if we go back and we look at our Lambda, let's refresh this. So now we're given access to Secrets Manager and CloudWatch logs. So let's, just out of curiosity, let's see now. Let's hit this endpoint again. So we've got a different error message now. So let's go back to the logs, just out of curiosity. And let's see what it says. So I don't see that error anymore. Or unless it's here, undefined. I don't know if that's the same one. Yeah, that's from a few minutes ago. Okay, I don't see a new log right now. Unless it put it in here just later on. Yeah, I think, okay, yeah, it did. So sometimes that's going to happen. You're going to have a separate log sometimes, and sometimes you won't. So we've got, it looks like that's working. So it timed out. I don't see the specific error on what happened. And I also don't see the console log, so it must not have made it that far. Here's an exception. Let's see this. Oh, that's the old one. Anyway, let's try to call this thing correctly with a parameter. So the way we can do that, we can go back to our application, and we're no longer going to call. So what we'll do, let me move this over a little bit so it's clear. I'm going to copy this down and then comment this out. So we're no longer going to call that endpoint. We're now going to call API Gateway. Put that address in here. So instead of calling ESV, we call API Gateway. API Gateway triggers a Lambda, which calls ESV with the query parameter that we're going to send. And then inside of the Lambda, it adds in the query parameter to the URL. So that has been deployed. Let's go into our app. Let's refresh. And let's see what happens here. First, make sure you've saved your change inside of your editor. And let's try to make a query. Say John 1:1. See what we get. Okay, that worked. Let's look at our network. As you can see, headers. So we called the Amazon URL and had that query parameter in there. And for the request headers, you don't see an API key anywhere in there anymore. It's no longer there. So if we go back, you lower this down a little bit. We go back into our editor and comment out, and we call ESV directly. We do that, and we'll look at the time. You can see here 260 milliseconds was when we called API Gateway. But when we call ESV, Axios network error. So let me refresh that. Oh, I know why. Because I'm not sending the authorization. So when we call ESV, you have to send the API key. And 75 milliseconds, really fast. But we are including the API key inside of the request header. Authorization right there. So let's go back. Let's not send it. Let's call AWS. Save that. It was 75 milliseconds before. Now we're going to do API Gateway. So undefined came back. I'm not sure why it came back like that, but there is, it's quite a bit slower. So that was faster then. It's probably cached. So it took almost half a second, whereas consistently when you call ESV directly, it was just 0.1. So it is a little bit slower, but it's more secure. So this is one use case of how you could use API Gateway, Lambda, and Secrets Manager. One of many use cases. And hopefully you learned something in the video. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.